Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video, we'll be taking a really detailed look at line of sight for kill teams. In this video, we'll be taking a really close look at line of sight. And I've already covered it in the How to Play Kill Team video, where I went through the rules included in the book with some visual examples using the miniatures on the tabletop. But in this video, I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail, and I've also reworded the rules a little bit to make it easier for me to understand, but also to put it across in a different way, and hopefully that's going to help you with the line of sight rules as well. The first thing we'll do is go through all the rules in the book and how I've reworded them, and then I'll use some examples here on the screen, just using some graphics to represent the different attacker and the targets, and go through some scenarios that directly relate to all the different elements of line of sight. And then once we've done that, I'll use some examples of models on the table with loads of different pieces of terrain, just so we can get a really good idea of how it actually works using the miniatures and the terrain. So line of sight is pretty confusing. I think that's for 5 reasons. The first is the way it's written. I think it's written in a real wordy way. I think it's totally unnecessary. It could really be worded a lot simpler. And so that's the first reason. The second is it's written out of order. You're reading through like obscured and cover before you've even got to the section about cover lines, and the obscured section is including cover lines in it. So you're skipping from one part to the next and then back again. And I just think doing that really doesn't help. And also, the examples overlap, and I think this can really add to the confusion. And I almost think the visual examples they've used in the book are coming at it from the perspective of two different fighters, the attacking fighter and the target fighter. And I think that could be split up into separate examples to make things a little bit easier. So in this video, I'll be going through those examples on the tabletop and then getting some new angles in there, hopefully to counter that. And I also think the rules in the core book don't take into account all the different types of terrain. And we saw that in the recent update with the commentators' notes, and where they use some thicker terrain to represent it. So because there is an issue of where the cover lines cross the terrain and how that interacts with the different line of sight rules. So hopefully we can address all that in this video. Okay, let's get started going through the line of sight rules. And the first change I made was in the wording of active operative, and I've just changed that to attacker, and intended target operative I've changed to target. Now let's look at the engage order. And so this is the first of the rules that we'll look at in the line of sight. And so it says if the target has an engage order, it is in the attacker's line of sight if it is visible and not obscured. So if that target's got an engage order, that means you can attack the target if they are in cover. And next we've got the conceal order. And if the target has a conceal order, it's in the attacker's line of sight if it is visible, not obscured, and not in cover. So if the target has a conceal order, you cannot attack that target if they are in cover. So I'm trying to think of this from a different angle. So with the engage order, I'm thinking of it that the attacker cannot attack if the target is obscured, and the attacker can attack if the target is in cover. And then with the conceal order, the attacker cannot attack if the target is obscured or in cover. So that's the engagement order and conceal order taken care of. So now let's have a look at cover lines. And here, an attacker draws a cone starting from any part of their base to every part of the target's base. So I've changed this slightly from the book where it's 2 lines, but the lines go out into a cone. So I think for me, it just made a lot more sense to just imagine a cone going from the attacker to the target. So let's see how that plays out. So here we've got our attacker, and here's our target. And now I've drawn a cone from the attacker to the target. And you can place this cone anywhere on the attacker's base towards that target. So you can see here how much of a difference that makes just by moving the position of the cone. And that's all we need to know about cover lines for now. And I've changed the order of this and put it before visibility, obscured, and cover. So those cover lines are really important, as each of these other aspects that we're going to look at now all refer to the cover lines. Now let's look at what it means to be visible. And it tells us that we can draw a line from the head of the attacker to any part of the target excluding the base. And so this is an imaginary line and it can't go through any walls or anything like that. So it's got to go from the head to any part. So here's our attacker, here's our target, and here's our imaginary line. So it starts on the head of the attacker, and now I'm moving it around to different parts of the target's body. So as long as you can do that, then that target will be visible. So that's pretty straightforward, and that's all we need to know about visibility. Now let's look at the obscured rule, and for a target to be obscured, they have to be more than 2 inches from a point at which a cover line crosses a terrain feature that is obscuring. However, if the attacker is within 1 inch of a point at which a cover line crosses a terrain feature that is obscuring, that part of the terrain feature is not obscuring. Right, so here's our example again. We've got our attacker and target and our cone for the cover lines. And here I've added a piece of terrain. So this is our terrain feature that is obscuring. And you can see that our target is more than 2 inches from the point at which that cover line crosses the terrain feature that is obscuring. In the recent errata, the designer's commentary talked about this point at which a cover line crosses a terrain feature, and it can be any point at which it crosses a terrain feature, and this is going to come up in the rules when we look at the next step, when we look at cover. So this is an important thing to bear in mind as well when you're working out the different distances and things for being obscured or in cover, especially when the terrain starts getting thicker, but we're going to cover that in a little while. So now let's go back to our example. We've got our terrain feature there. The target is more than 2 inches away from it. And so that means the attacker cannot attack them. They're not in line of sight and he cannot attack them. Now let's move that terrain feature closer to our attacker. And now the attacker is within 1 inch of a point at which a cover line crosses that terrain feature. The target is still more than 2 inches away. And now, because our attacker is within 1 inch of that point, that means that they can attack the target. Now let's make that terrain feature a lot wider. Let's imagine there's some other elements in there, and where that dotted line, that represents an area that is also potentially obscuring. And so our attacker is still less than 1 inch from the terrain feature, and our target is more than 2 inches. But if we move that distance and remeasure it from that dotted line, that center point of this wider terrain feature, now the attacker is more than 1 inch away from it. But although our attacker is more than 1 inch away, our target is still more than 2 inches away, and so that means the attacker cannot attack the target now. And just referring back to that designer's commentary, I've circled it where it says of a point, and now we can just think of it of any point. So I read in one of the comments on one of the videos about obscured, and someone come up with a great idea. I wish I made a note of who said it, but the idea is to imagine you're looking through a hole in a wall and you're far away from that hole, so you can't see much of what's going on the other side. So if you imagine you're trying to look at a target through that hole, you're not going to see much of them. But as the attacker, as you move closer to that hole, your vision widens beyond the hole and you can see a lot more of everything beyond it, including your target. So you can see a lot more of the target now. And so that feature, that terrain feature, isn't obscuring as much of them as it would be if you were further away. That covers the obscured rule. So now let's look at cover. And to be in cover, the target is more than 2 inches from the attacker. And the target is within 1 inch of a point at which a cover line crosses another operative's base or a terrain feature that provides cover. So let's grab our attacker and target and that cone to represent the cover lines again, and we can see here that the target is more than 2 inches away from the attacker. So that's the first condition met, but now let's introduce another operative, and here we can see the blue circle representing the base of that operative, and they are less than 1 inch away from the target, so now the target is in cover. The target has met both those conditions, it's more than 2 inches away, and it's within 1 inch of a point in which a cover line crosses another operative's base. Now, if this isn't enough, we did get an update in the errata, and we have to put another sentence into this rule, and it tells us that we have to add, unless that other operative is not itself in the attacker's line of sight. So let's have a look and see exactly what that means. So here I've introduced a terrain feature now, so that's going to go in front of the base of the operative in blue, and I've moved the attacker and the cover line cone. So now the attacker, although the cover line still crosses the base of that operative, the attacker does not have visibility to them. If we were to draw an imaginary line from the head of the attacker, the chances are they're not going to hit any part of the body of the figure that is on top of that base. And to be visible, we can't use the base when we're working out whether or not the operative is visible or not. So now the target, although they're within 1 inch of a point in which a cover line crosses another operative's base, that other operative is not itself in the attacker's line of sight, and so it doesn't count. So that target in red would not be uncovered now if they were to use the operative in blue. I hope that bit made sense. I think that little bit they've added from the errata has almost made it a little bit more confusing, but it's just going to be so much to work out when you're playing a game. It's a bit much, really, a bit much going on, but hopefully that clarifies that bit that they've added in the errata. So we've covered now how an operative's base affects the cover, but let's look at how a terrain feature provides cover. And now we can see that we've got this brown terrain feature here, and our target is less than 1 inch from where the cover line crosses that terrain feature. And you can see I've used the point that's furthest away from our target there. So it's still less than 1 inch though. So the target is classed as in cover. It's met the condition of being 2 inches away from the attacker and the condition of being within 1 inch of a point at which a cover line crosses a terrain feature. And that terrain feature provides cover. So there we go. Now we've gone through all the line of sight rules and just approached it in a different way than how I did the video in the How to Play Kill Team series. So this has really helped me, just changing those words slightly, reducing the wordiness down a little bit, and just looking at it in a different way and reordering where we put things like the cover lines before we look at the different rules for visibility, obscuring and cover and things like that. So that's really helped, and I hope that's helped you too. And so now let's have a look at some examples on the tabletop using some miniatures and different pieces of terrain and see if we could lay this out in action. Let's have a look at the terrain, and first of all we've got heavy terrain, and this will provide cover and is also obscuring. Then we've got light terrain, and this will only provide cover unless otherwise specified, and we have to think about something called vantage points as well when looking at cover, but I'm not going to include that in this video, otherwise it's just going to be too much, but we can look at that later on. In our first example, we'll look at obscuring. We've got some heavy terrain, our attacker is the veteran guardsman, and our target is the Orc Nob Commando, who also has an engage order. The attacker is more than 1 inch away from the heavy terrain, and the target is more than 2 inches away from the heavy terrain. Here you can see the cover lines or the cone coming from the attacker to the target. Those cover lines cross a terrain feature that is obscuring, and that's because it's a heavy terrain. Because the target is more than 2 inches away from the point where those cover lines cross that terrain feature, that target is obscured, and therefore he's not in line of sight of the attacker, and an attack cannot be made against him. In this second example, we've moved the attacker to within 1 inch of a point at which a cover line crosses the terrain feature that is obscuring. For our target, the conditions are the same as the previous example. We've got cover lines crossing a terrain feature that's obscuring, and he's more than 2 inches away from the point that the cover lines cross that terrain feature. But as our attacker is now within 1 inch of the point where the cover lines cross the terrain feature, the target is not obscured and is now in line of sight, and an attack can be made against him. In this next example, we've moved the attacker away from that 1 inch range of the terrain feature, and our target is now within 2 inches of the terrain feature. Even though the cover lines cross a point of that terrain feature that is obscuring the heavy terrain, and the veteran guardsman, the attacker, is more than 1 inch away from that terrain feature, the target is still not obscured and is in line of sight, and an attack can be made against them. And this is because the target is within 2 inches of the point where those cover lines cross the terrain feature. Now let's look at an example with two terrain features, and you can see we've got the heavy terrain for both terrain features, and we've got the same attacker and the same target, and our target still has an engage order. The attacker is within 1 inch of the terrain feature, and the target is within 2 inches of the terrain feature. You can see here that they're both within those distances of cover lines where they cross the terrain features. Because the attacker is within 1 inch of a point on that terrain feature where the cover lines cross it, that cancels that out, and so that piece of terrain is no longer obscuring. The target is within 2 inches of his piece of terrain where the cover lines cross the terrain feature, and so that terrain feature is not obscuring either. So the target is in line of sight and it's not obscured, and an attack can be made against them. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky. We've now got our attacker who's more than 1 inch away from the terrain feature on the left, and our target is within 2 inches of the terrain feature on the right, and he still has that engage order. You can see where the cover lines cross both terrain features, but in this example, the attacker won't have any part to play in the line of sight and deciding whether or not the target is obscured, because he's more than 1 inch away from that terrain feature where the cover lines cross. So let's focus on the target here, and if the target is within 2 inches of the right hand side piece of terrain, then that's not obscuring him. But he's not within 2 inches of the left hand side piece of terrain. So I would argue that that piece of terrain is obscuring him, and therefore he's not in line of sight, and an attack cannot be made against him. I could well be wrong here, but I'd love to know what you think, so let me know in the comment sections below whether you agree or whether you disagree with that conclusion. Here's another tricky example. We've got our attacker now within 1 inch of the terrain on the left, but our target is more than 2 inches away from the terrain on the right. You can see where the cover lines cross over the different terrain features, and in this case we're going to have to take into account both the attacker and the target. Because the attacker is less than 1 inch away from the terrain feature where the cover lines cross, that terrain feature is not obscuring. But the target is more than 2 inches away from the right hand side piece of terrain where the cover lines cross it, and so that piece is obscuring, and so the target is obscured, he's not in line of sight, and the attacker cannot make an attack against him. Now let's mix it up a bit more and put the attacker 1 inch away from the terrain feature and the target more than 2 inches away from the terrain feature. This one's a lot more straightforward, and we can see our attacker is more than 1 inch away from the point where those cover lines cross the terrain feature, so he's not going to have a say in whether or not the terrain features are obscuring. But our target is more than 2 inches away from a terrain feature where those cover lines cross, and so he's again obscured, he's not in line of sight, and the attacker cannot make an attack against him. Now let's look at an example of cover, and here we've got some light terrain. Our attacker is the veteran guardsman, and our target is the orc commando, and our orc commando has now got a conceal order. The attacker is more than 2 inches away from the target, and the target is within 1 inch of the terrain feature. So we can see we've got a cone of cover lines going across that terrain feature, and that puts our target in cover, so he's not in line of sight, and an attack cannot be made against him. But what happens if he's not within 1 inch of that terrain feature? So let's explore that scenario here, and you can see the target is now more than 1 inch away from the feature, and the attacker is still more than 2 inches away from that target. The cover lines cross it in the same position, but now he's not in cover because he's more than 1 inch away. He's not in cover, he's in line of sight, and now an attack can be made against him. Now let's mix this up a bit, and now we've got our attacker within 2 inches of our target, and our target within 1 inch of the terrain feature. And here we can see those cover lines, and even though the target is within 1 inch of a point at which those cover lines cross the terrain feature, it doesn't matter because the attacker is within 2 inches now of the target. That means the target is not in cover, it's in line of sight, and an attack can be made. The next examples are going to be based on the designer's commentary that came out with the errata for Kill Team, and I wasn't sure which heavy terrain to use for this, so I'm going to use this piece that came in the Octarius set, and we're just going to pretend this is heavy, and as a heavy piece of terrain it provides cover and it's obscuring. So a few house rules implemented here for this part of the video. So now we've got the same attacker, the same target, and our target has an engage order this time. Our attacker is less than 1 inch away from the terrain feature, and our target is more than 2 inches away from the terrain feature. So here we can see the cover line cone, and so our target is more than 2 inches away from the point where those two cover lines or the cover cone crosses the terrain feature, and the attacker is less than 1 inch away from the point where the cover lines cross the terrain feature. On a normal piece of heavy terrain, this target would not be obscured and they would be within the line of sight of the attacker who could make an attack against them. But in this case, they are not in the line of sight and they are obscured, so no attack can be made. Let's take a look at this again just to see why that's the case. And so here we've got a red dotted line going down the center of this terrain piece. And this is a point on the terrain feature where cover lines cross. So we can take our measurements for both our attacker and target from that point. And this is where things now change. So where we thought initially the attacker was less than 1 inch away from the point where the cover lines cross the terrain feature, now he's more than 1 inch away. And so that's going to change whether or not this terrain feature is obscuring the target or not. Luckily for our target, wherever we put that line on this particular terrain feature, he's going to be more than 2 inches away. And so he can remain obscured and then is not in line of sight and an attack cannot be made against him. So this really changes up depending on the terrain you use. If you use a large piece of terrain that has different terrain features or traits on it, that's going to affect line of sight and have a big effect on whether or not you can attack the enemy fighters. Now let's move that target in a bit closer. So now he's within 2 inches of a point where the cover lines cross the terrain feature. And here again we can see the cone there going across it. So now the attacker's within 1 inch of the terrain feature and the target is within 2 inches of the terrain feature. But even so, the target is still not in line of sight, they're obscured, and so an attack cannot be made against them. And so we're looking at this red line again to figure out why. So we know that the attacker is now more than 1 inch away from that point of the heavy terrain feature where the lines cross over. But our target, although initially was within 2 inches of a point where the cover lines cross the terrain feature, he's now more than 2 inches away from the point that we're using as our reference. So he can be obscured and then an attack cannot be made against him as he's not in line of sight. So there we go, there's the examples complete, and we've also gone through all the rules for line of sight in a slightly different way than we did in the How to Play Kill Team series. I really don't like these line of sight rules now. The more I've played it, the worse it's got. Playing with 10 models on each side, it's just constantly measuring and just going back and making sure that these measurements are right. I'm just not getting along with it, so I'm not really enjoying this aspect of it. I think there's just so many parts to line of sight to consider when you're playing the game. You know, we've got our engage order and conceal order, which then affects things. We've got cover lines, visibility, obscuring, and cover. And then we haven't even taken into account vantage points yet, which are on a different page altogether in the core rulebook. So there's lots of aspects to line of sight. It's not just the 2 pages on pages 70 and 71 of the core rules. We've also got to take into account the different terrain traits on page 72 and the vantage point as well, which again we haven't even covered yet. There's quite a lot going on here, and I think it can really be simplified, and I don't think that simplification will take away from the game. I think if I was playing competitive match play, I might think about it totally differently, and having all these nuances within the rules, you could really work to your favour as you were playing tactically and developing tactics for your own particular kill team. You could make a lot of this work for you. But for me, I'm more narrative driven, and I think that's why I'm struggling with it. I just want to enjoy the game. I'm not playing competitively, and so for me, I think this is way too much. So I'm going to change the line of sight rules when I play the game and make it a lot easier. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to completely strip it down. I'm going to take away the rules for the engage order and the conceal order, get rid of those cover lines, obscuring. I'll include cover and visibility, and then just do some workarounds, and also maybe implement some cool rules for that conceal order. And my first idea would look something like this. I'd stick to the attacker and target, and we would just have visible and cover to start with. And visible, for that, I would draw an imaginary line from the top of the attacking model's head to any part of the target model you want to attack, but not including the base. So that's remained the same. And if you can see any part of that target model, they are now in the line of sight, and that attacker can attack them. So that's really made that a lot easier now. If they're visible, they're in line of sight. And then moving over to cover, if 50% or more of a target is hidden by terrain, obstacles, or another target, then they are in cover. And if you disagree with your opponent about the percentage, then you can simply roll off and then let the dice decide. But then I was thinking about how we could use the conceal order, because I think the whole idea of this is to replicate an operative like crouching down or ducking down behind a piece of terrain, or like making a dash to get behind somewhere. So it's kind of representing that. So I figured, rather than doing the orders at each like turn or each round, I thought it would be better just to say that the operatives are automatically all have the engage order. And then if they want to use the conceal order to duck, I would change it and call it duck or go to ground. And then this would be a action that they can take, and operatives can spend 1 action point to duck or go to ground. And when they've gone to ground, they'll receive then the conceal order. And if they're in cover with that conceal order, they cannot attack or be attacked at range. And then at the end of their next activation, that conceal order is removed and they go back to automatically having the engage order. So I think that's a cool way to keep that idea of them ducking down behind a barrier into the game, but without complicating this line of sight too much. And I think this is going to make it a lot easier for narrative play. It's going to help with the immersion and keep the action flowing, and then also less measurements to be taken all the time too. But I'm sure once you play it properly and you're playing match play and you're really playing lots of games, you really could make it work for you. But if you're like me and want to play narratively, then I think this might be a good way to go. I'd love to know what you think about this, and do you think this would be a good way to play if you wanted to strip it down a bit and make it a bit easier? Or do you like the line of sight rules? Do you think they work, and are they becoming more intuitive the more you play? So I'd love to hear what you think about that, and also everything we've gone through in this video. Hopefully it's helped out a little bit and made it a little bit easier. Maybe some parts, just explaining it a different way, have really helped to get it in there, and with a few more examples than we've got in the book as well, I think that might be helpful. So there we go. That's everything that we're going to look at today for line of sight, but we've still got to come back at some point and look at vantage points. This is probably one of the hardest videos I've made. I was really being careful to use the correct words, but I'm sure I've made some mistakes along the way. So if there's anything I've got wrong, or you're not sure of, or you think, oh, that doesn't seem right, then just let me know in the comment sections below, and I'd love to hear what you think, and also make sure we're getting this right, because it's quite complicated, and yeah, want to make sure that it's done properly. Thanks so much for watching. If you did make it all the way through, then congratulations. That was a big marathon and a big detailed look at what line of sight's involved for Kill Team. But thanks again for watching. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games. If you like this kind of content and would like to support the channel, then please check out my Patreon page, and thanks to everyone who's joined so far. It's really awesome. We hang out on Discord, talk about the hobby, share ideas and help each other out, and you'll get some perks there that you're not going to find anywhere else. So I'll put a link in the description, and it'd be great to see you there.